Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to this presentation. We are presenting this book, Nervous States, that is a title, and we will discuss about disinformation, sentiment, nationalism, populism, all those phenomena that are so common nowadays in the world. The hashtag, if you want to send any comment or remark, is hashtag Estados nerviosos, so that you can use it if you're at home. If you are watching us through the streaming, you can also send your questions or your comments through Twitter. And talking about questions, later on there will be a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or any remark, please be concise. And then he will be signing books of copies of the book if you want it dedicated. I will introduce the people with me. First of all, the author of the book, William Davies. He's a sociologist and economist, and he's a co-manager of the political economy, Goldsmith Political Economy Center. He belongs to the University of London. He has written The Limits of Neoliberalism and The Happiness Industry. He has also written for The Guardian, Newell's Review, The New York Times, or The Atlantic, among others. And we have Clara Jimenez Cruz, journalist and co-founder of the not-for-profit organization Maldita.es, which fights disinformation. She collaborates with Onda Cero, Telemadrid, Radio Nacional, and TVE. She is the only Spaniard in the high-level expert group that advises the European Union, and she belongs to the fact-checking net. And we have Pablo Simón, who is a professor of political science in the Carlos III University of Madrid, and he's specialized in political parties, electoral campaigns, and he has a PhD by the Pompeu Fabra University. He's a co-author of the La Urna Rota, and he's a very well-known analyst in media such as El País, La Sexta, or Cadena Ser. He has published recently El Príncipe Moderno, his first book. And I'm the moderator. My name is Fernando Aracón, the manager of El Orden Mundial, which is a international analysis organization. For those of you who are just discovering this new book and you haven't read it fully, what we are talking about is that the experts are not what they used to be, or at least their influence is not the one that they used to have. One of the pillars of the building of the modern state and the rules that have been dominating and guiding our actions is the faith in data by experts and expert knowledge, and that is coming apart, and those foundations are very shaky right now. So what he says in his book is that instead we are replacing them, for that objective data is being replaced by emotions that are channeled through those last minute information that we receive and the social media, which in the end is a way of, or a type of political behavior that many political parties and many people are using for their own benefit. And from there we could perhaps mention a whole array of populist parties in the Western world. So just to open up the discussion and the debate, I think we should make it as dynamic as possible. William, in your book you mentioned that one of those factors for the detachment from the political and scientific and economic elites is that they have abandoned what Thomas Hobbes said, that the governor should keep passions aside, so to speak, and they should work towards an order that was shared among others. That happened at a point in time when there was despotic governments and very little democracy, and paradoxically now with the most clear democratic area that we have seen in the world, that is being questioned. What is behind that? What is the reason?
That one of the ways in which expertise has always functioned throughout its history, and you're right that I, in the book, go back to the early modern times to talk about the origins of experts, as we understand them, the scientific communities, the early statistical experts, these sorts of institutions and figures. But they had to be, in some sense, insulated effectively from politics in some way. They had to be seen as making claims that were not political or theological or moral. There was a lot of work that went into keeping them outside of the space of political argument and moral argument. Work that sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't succeed so well. I think that what we've seen over the last few decades are various forces which have gradually dissolved the boundaries separating spheres of expertise from politics. Now, one way in which that happens is the growth of what is generally called technocracy, which is that the space separating the state and communities of expertise shrinks to the point where these people all begin to look roughly the same. The technocrats of the central banks, the regulators, the sorts of political forces that by definition are not democratically validated. That's part of how their power works. And I think that has clearly added momentum to populist claims that there is a single kind of liberal elite of people who went to the same sorts of universities and come from the same sorts of backgrounds, and whether you call them politicians or judges or experts or academics is really not that important because these boundaries have been dissolving. But the other thing which I think is important here is one thing I think we're seeing is a side effect, an unintentional side effect of the birth of what in the 80s and 90s was celebrated as the knowledge economy, which basically said that the purpose of knowledge is not to provide neutral, objective pictures of the world. It's to help develop industry, it's to help get things done, that science is a factor in regional prosperity, in development, in innovation, and for the same reason, knowledge becomes treated more and more as a private asset, something to be kept secret, something that is valuable because my rivals don't have it, so that knowledge starts to become something closer to what it is like under conditions of warfare, which is a type of intelligence, something which I have to keep, I have to restrain, I have to keep it to myself, I have to avoid others getting it. This is the business model of what is now recognized as the platform economy, surveillance capitalism of Silicon Valley, where the fact that Facebook and Google does not reveal everything they know is central to how they function as businesses and how they make their profits. Now, I say all of that to provide some sort of sociological background to, I think, some political and philosophical crises that took much longer than that to become clear. The panic of post-truth, fake news, the lying populists of the last 5 years or so. I think that if we only focus on the individuals and the liars and the lies themselves, we miss the fact that the way in which we bestow authority on certain types of experts, I think has undergone changes over a number of decades.
Has mencionado, has hecho...
You have given us quite a thorough analysis of technocrats, a concept that we have seen for years during the crisis. About, for example, with Greece, they spoke about technocrats. Of course, they are necessary, and I'm just to define it is like a class, an enlightened class that has a specific knowledge and that can implement them within the state to help the state and society improve. Of course, they are essential, and they continue to be essential now. But at the same time, they are perceived as a threat, as a problem, because they are part of that status quo of the state. As soon as we perceive the state as a problem, those people that are inside, it can go from nurses to judges, they are also perceived as part of the problem. How can we get out of that paradox, so to speak?
One thing that has happened is that one of the errors of technocracy, I mean, certain types of power have moved further and further away from lived experiences of people. So there is, I think, across Western democracies, a sense that the sources or the centers of power have become foreign, have become almost like imperialists over the nation, however understood. This is very pronounced in the United States, in Tea Party activists and so on. It's crucial to Brexit, which really, I think Brexit is better understood as an anti-London movement, but there wasn't a vote about that, so it became an anti-Brussels movement. I think that there is this sense of these concentrations of expertise and of power that have created this alienation. Now, one of the problems there is that these technocrats, many of them are very bad at self-criticism. They're very bad at understanding their own failures. They don't acknowledge their failures. And there's been some terrible hubris, particularly leading up to 2008 and the crisis, that certain types of policies were risk-free, that they were rationally correct, and therefore they didn't require any type of democratic validation. So I think that this is a phenomenon that makes considerable sense in many ways. But at the same time, I think that the other thing which I think is, when you're talking about technocracy in relation to the Euro crisis, one of the arguments I make in the book is if you go back to the origins of expertise, much of where our core ideas of liberalism, of modern government and of expertise come from is in the idea of some vague idea of progress, that things are going to get better, that the reason we measure gross domestic product in the economy is to see how much it's growing. The reason we measure the population is because we want the population to grow. There was an assumption built into this project that these were things that swelled over time, and that in some ways the gambit of liberalism is to say, you all have to give up your dreams of heroism, your dreams of being a great hero and a great warrior, and in return you're going to get this thing we call progress. Now, what's happened since 2008, and in the United States actually has happened in the mid-1970s for a lot of people, is that project, that offer, has fallen apart, in that life expectancy is falling in lots of parts of Europe and the United States. Economic growth is clearly no longer the purpose of the European project as such. I mean, if it ever was. And I think that there's a sort of in some ways, technocracy seems like a naked power project to a much greater extent than it used to. Now, there was a kind of transitional phase. I mean, the heyday of sort of progressive, expansionary liberalism was the post-war Keynesian era, when quality of life and wealth grew for the vast majority of people in the developed world. And that, I think, has gradually been fraying for some time. But I think that once you say that technocracy is the overseeing of stagnation, technocracy suddenly seems like a very different type of entity altogether.
Vamos, diría que los cuatro que estamos aquí es un poco parado.
I think that the four people here, we could be part of those experts that are there, are questioned, that give figures and numbers and tell stories. But perhaps it is a mistake to think, and you say that in your book, that there are people who do not see the world in the same way we see it, for different reasons or considerations. But for you, Clara, that work with this information, to what extent is there still lots of people that do not understand our language, the language that we use, the concepts that we use, the ideas with which we work, and what have we left behind along the way? And I'm not talking about, I'm trying to be negative towards those people. It is negative about us. We have left people aside or behind. We are not able to convey that knowledge. For example, people that were drinking seawater, for example, that was one of the fake news. How can you do that? Or how can you believe that people are doing that? How can we recover those people, rescue those people?
Well, I have some doubts as to whether it is, they don't understand us, or maybe they are not interested in us. And maybe this is something that we should be critical about. The same way experts, and in my case, I think journalists, in the end, our task is to try to explain and simplify complex concepts for the normal audience. And I think that experts, precisely with experts, it has been with experts what William was mentioning. I mean, they have been experts normally are educated people, they have gone to university, etc. And for a lot of people, experts are like very high up in the hierarchy. And some of the things that happened to us in Maldita, in my company, Maldita.es, I don't care whether people answer or not. The moment that social media open up and people can answer to our questions, we realize that we need to open up the floor to audiences, to the general public. And then you realize what needs more explanation, what needs to be clarified, because when you listen to citizens, you realize that, for example, they don't know what a royal decree is. And to tell them news, we need to first explain what things, what concepts like royal decrees are. And we, of course, are accustomed to speaking about this every day, but these people, normal people, are working outside their homes for 10 hours, then they are tired when they go back, and they don't want to, deal with complex concepts. I think that our mistake is not to maybe not explain our concepts in a way that is attractive to them. In the case of Maldita.es, instead of giving an article, four-page long article, I can create a video with funny pictures or something. I can understand that somebody after work will not really involve themselves into reading a very long article.
In the end, we see that there are many things that are there that we take for granted and perhaps people do not really grasp. We are in the campaign, in an election campaign right now, and I hope that Pablo can give us his point of view. But for electoral programs, whenever there are elections, we are getting used to having electoral programs, and we ask for them. But how many people are reading those and or are using those for the purpose for which they are created, to compare that with what the parties do afterwards? Or is it just a press release for them to disseminate their ideas? For example, the concept of an electoral program, is it an anachronic element, or is it something that makes no sense whatsoever? Yes, it is true that people do not read them, and our democracies can work without people reading electoral programs, and I'm going to try to explain why now. Before, I wanted to make a comment regarding what William said, which I think is essential, which is the idea of highlighting again that technocratic fallacy. Technocracy is based on the idea that there is in politics an optimum solution to every problem, and that, of course, by definition, is the negation of politics, because policy is to compare different worldviews and different projects. So part of the arrogance behind technocrats is to assume that their vision of the world is the only possible and positive one, and they have ignored what, in my opinion, is fundamental, which is the political economy of the decisions that they make. And so in politics, what is important is not to be right, is to be consider that you are right. That is something Adenauer said, and it is fundamental. What is important is that you can persuade or convince people that your program is the best, and to take into account the opinions of the people that will have to support that program in an election. So regarding your specific question, we are aware that the information helps people make better decisions. If you take social psychology experiments, that is undoubted. A recent experiment which checked how the preferences of the citizens change regarding how much money to redistribute if they knew what their position was within the income per capita income was. Perhaps if they consider that they are high class or medium class, or if you give people information, their preferences change. So information can be useful for people. But what I think that we are living right now is a crisis of the priests that administered the information, the journalists, the parties, the experts, the trade unions, the churches, those that we trusted for data to be given to us. Now we distrust them for many reasons that we can discuss at length now. But I have the impression that that information continues to be essential, but we shouldn't forget that for many people, voting is not just about deciding what project is executed, but about who is going to represent me. And for representation purposes, I only need to know whether you are similar to me, whether we resemble each other. And that explains sometimes that we see a boom in certain movements, because when you have no certainty about information, you go to that people that you believe that will represent your interests better, regardless of the project that they intend to execute. That is, I think, part of what we are seeing in many of our countries now, and that leads us to think, and I'm being provoking, we think that perhaps voting some parties in certain circumstances is not irrational. If you feel that you are a loser in this global context, it is not irrational to prefer one of those parties that promise to restore the world where you felt more safer. And that is an important reflection that we have to have, the relationship between information, perception, and representation. William was mentioning in his book that regarding feeling or sentiment, that loss of nationality, so to speak, that people vote passionately because of an impression, because of affinity, identities, and not so much thinking about the logic of that rationalist thinking. They do not carry out a surgical analysis of things. They just vote. It is an impulse. And that is what, in the end, that determines things. And to what extent that change has affected us. Choosing, for example, Trump, Brexit, Colombia, National Front, and so on and so forth, we have seen that in a few years, everything seems to have changed radically. Or was it coming and we didn't realize?
I suppose the sort of classic 20th century vision of political parties was one that they represented in some sense class interests in some way. The key term there being interests, that if I'm a member of the working class, that I don't need to understand everything about corporate governance and labour market policy, because I can join a union that will act in my interests regardless. Or equally, if I'm a member of the bourgeois managerial class, I can rely on certain entities such as the trade bodies, the employers' organisations to do the same, or the conservative parties, or whatever it might be. And I think that idea that people are defined by a set of interests has been fraying for really quite a long time, in the sense that, firstly, I think some of these class divisions have got a lot less clear. But also I think that in some ways what happened to political parties in many countries over the 1990s and 2000s, particularly, I mean, in Britain, Tony Blair's Labour Party was a classic case of this, but this has been something that has happened to many centre-left parties around the world, was that they did become more technocratic with making the errors that Pablo was referring to. And then the question is then, so what does a political party even mean once it's no longer performing that act of representation of interests? And at that point, the question is not, do I feel represented by this, but does this thing move me? Does it affect me? Does it have some kind of impact on me in some way? And I think that being moved by a leader or by a party, I mean, these have always been parts of politics. I mean, it's not recent that political parties have, thought about framing and messaging and advertising and that sort of thing. But I think that what is recent is that has become, we've seen with phenomena such as Donald Trump, where in some ways the entire logic of, he's a reality TV star, the entire logic of the entertainment industry, and again, Reagan came before this, so it's not new that a type of sort of screen-based celebrity becomes a politician. But I think that for a political party to be entirely established around this type of logic is a relatively new thing. And then you throw in the technologies of sentiment analysis, sentiment detection, and sentiment manipulation, for want of a better word, and you're in a totally different type of democratic space where these sorts of channels that we used to kind of take for granted, through which different elites would represent the people, whether representing them through some particular code of the public interest in the case of certain kinds of experts, or a particular professional duty on the part of journalists, or some idea of people's interests as supporters of a party. That these sorts of relationships, I think, have kind of dissolved really over the last 20 years, and we're now witnessing what happens in that context.
Es que lo que tú comentabas, hace unas décadas.
A few decades ago, the world that we are living today, it would be unthinkable. There's a piece of data that you give in your book, and I'm going to mention it. Poor of the poorest people in the U.S. did not see their wealth increase in the 40 years before Donald Trump. So wealth, that concept of growth, of improving, of everything going better, is not the same for everyone. And when we add that to global scale changes, globalization has changed, the advent of the internet also changed. The world before the internet was completely different to the one we have now. And there's something that reminds me of an idea that I heard Pablo say once, which is one of the main elements of identity, which seems to be the pivot, what everything is pivoting around right now. 40 years ago, that those ages where Donald Trump wants to go back to, work was the main identity of most of the working class, which was the majority in the US, but it is not any longer. How can you link that loss, the loss of an identity? We now have a whole supermarket of identities, and what is the identity you want, and the political parties are giving a whole range of offers. Yeah, I think we have lost some anchoring, and that is intrinsical to the transformations that took place in the last 40 years. The economic crisis has just unveiled those structural changes in a very crude way through a syndrome that is shared by the majority of the Western countries. In most of the Western countries, we are seeing the same dynamics of electoral volatility, risk of authoritarian regression, and so on. In a world that is ever smaller, and nation states that have less room for maneuver to manage, because we have corporations that are even more powerful than governments, and that's something that we are seeing on a daily basis. We used to think that it was normal. For example, we have presidents in the regions of Spain that are asking companies to please bring specific models of a car for certain factories. If that is not looking for economic power to beg for investment in your region, just tell me. But those changes, I think, cannot be reversed. There's no way back. When the toothpaste has come out of the tube, it is impossible to bring it back inside. So we have to recreate or restructure the relationships that we are going to have in our society regarding the administration and also with representation. There's two sides to the coin that are both linked together. The short-term vision of our politicians, which is very much related to those structural changes. They see the world shake below their feet, and also social movements that have a transnational character or vocation, like environmentalism and so on. And they are very much related to that world of representation. That's the world we are living right now, a world where the traditional agents are recycling themselves, so to speak, and that is going to create a whole new landscape. The question that we should ask ourselves is how much of the good things of the old world will we be able to keep? There are many good things that we have in our luggage, so to speak, from the last 50 years. So, and if we have created a certain well-being and checks and balances, so to speak, if we want to create now like a parenthesis in history, and we want to go back to something like the 19th century that is more irregular, or we look for new ways to manage that, to have a global governance, and that underlies some of the initiatives that the European Commission is proposing for management of information. Yes, and we have cracks coming up in this structure that we had. It is an excellent world, excellent I mean negatively, for the disinformation. We are looking for a new alternative. And in your book, you speak about the trolls, and we will delve deeper into that, because of course there is a very interesting part in the book about that. But just to lay the foundations, we shouldn't go to Russia to look for sources of disinformation that emerge in Facebook, Instagram. What ones would be the main ones in Spain, for example?
When, especially in Spain, we don't have proofs to say that it is the Russians that only disinform people. I think that mainly, without pointing at anybody, because this is something that is not supported by data, I would say that there are certain identities that are especially being powerful when it comes to distributing disinformation in Spain. For example, anti-immigration speeches. This is like a key within the disinformation speeches or discourses. We also see other discourses that have certain problems with the new identities, such as feminism, for example. They try to attack that identity with gender issues, many times by handling disinformation. These are the two basic ones, and there's an extremely harmful third one that has to do with pseudoscience. We've seen that it is really powerful in Italy, where the anti-vaccine movement is really powerful, and here in Spain we were having problems with people drinking seawater, and we are starting to see this with more relevance or weight than before. One of the things that happens with the new search for identities, referring to what Pablo was saying, where are we going to, referring to the 19th century, well, everything is so fragmented that the recollocation of the different identities that we are choosing when we stop being a workforce is going to be very complicated. Why? Because many of them are crashing against each other, and recollocating all this is not simple, not a simple task, and now politics is not at a level where it can help to reinstate this puzzle, and therefore we are all falling apart.
Por cierto, no bebáis agua de mar, que no le hemos...
Please, I would like to say, don't drink seawater, please, because you get dehydrated. But pseudosciences, in the end, is just a questioning of many of the things that has helped us to make progress, which is a science. You are questioning science as a whole, and you mentioned that at the end. You say that we are tending towards a continuous war on the internet, even dialectically, against everything that is established force. How can we face that continuous war, where some sectors, or at least small pieces, are pushing us towards?
I mean, this is I think there's a we got the internet very wrong when it first became part of society in the 90s. There was this expectation that it was something a bit like the printing press, and that it was going to give birth to a kind of new enlightenment and a deliver on the dreams of liberal democracy. And I think I mean, rather, as in the cases Clara's talking about, that we've now realized that the internet is not a machine for producing consensus in the way that the printing press in the hands of editors and so on has been. It's a machine for producing dissensus. It's a consensus breaking machine more than anything else. And I think that this is the this is the great challenge. I think that now, if two things look like news and look like credible information and one is invented and one isn't, it's very, very difficult, obviously, to know what is the thing that you can do about that. And as I say in the book, I mean, one of the sort of, I suppose, one of the ways in which populism has there were certain truths that populists tell about liberals. You know, they say you come from these kinds of backgrounds, and it's sort of, well, you know, the liberal elites, and yes, this is true to some extent. But it's also true that, I mean, if I read something in the Financial Times, I don't kind of go and follow all of the methodology and all of the sort of, you know, go and check the original source and so on. I'm going on the basis of, you know, it looks right, you know, maybe it's a GIF on Twitter, but it looks like a Financial Times one, and it kind of reinforces certain views I have about the world, or whatever it might be. So, I mean, we're all vulnerable to this sort of thing. I think that one thing which I think is maybe worth noting in all of this is that experts, certainly, I mean, I'm not sure about the surveys in Spain, but internationally there is a general trend, which is that trust in science and in the source of expertise is still pretty high across most countries. Particularly, and this is something which I think is interesting, I'll talk a bit about in the book, the medical profession has extremely high levels of trust. Where people have suffered a complete collapse of trust is, as Pablo was talking about, the politicians and the journalists, the people who are in some ways at the center of allowing this thing called the liberal public sphere to function, are the people who are the gatekeepers or were the gatekeepers of news and information, namely the journalists, and then the politicians who are the sort of the representatives of the people. Now, I think that there has been a complete collapse of belief in this, and I think that if we focus on some of the constitutional issues at hand, and to look at who are the people who are vulnerable to this kind of fake news, well, it's the same people who have felt like their world has fallen apart economically and politically in other ways. So if you take something like the anti-vaccine phenomenon, what moves the anti-vaccine phenomenon, the movement, is not the fact that there is loads of misinformation about vaccines online, although there is lots of misinformation about vaccines online. But the people who are vulnerable to that misinformation are the same people who feel utterly alienated from politics, who feel that the news is lying to them, who feel that nobody represents them and nobody cares about them. And then someone wants to come along and shove a syringe in their baby's arm without even explaining why. And it's actually a broader political, a broader crisis in our politics and our media. Now, that doesn't exactly how you repair that is a whole other matter. But at least I think we can't get too focused on the idea that the system is okay, but that the individual sort of chunks of content perform this very disruptive effect. I mean, there's been studies done of what happened in the 2016 election in the United States. There's this excellent book called Network Propaganda by Yochai Benkler and some co-authors. And it showed that actually there was the people who believed the theories about Hillary Clinton running a pedophile network out of a pizza restaurant. It wasn't just that they saw this on Facebook. It was also being discussed in Fox News. It was also being discussed. There was Breitbart as crucial. Frighteningly, there were also some European right-wing newspapers who were in the thick of this. So actually there was a whole infrastructure of actually quite professional media. And of course it was being supported by the fact that the Republican Party was kind of allowing this to go on. So it was in some ways not a traditional political problem, but it wasn't simply the fact that it's now possible to produce kind of deep fakes or something that had purely been generated by technology.
Porque en estas situaciones que en la final
in these situations where the big platforms on the internet, you are mentioning Facebook, Google, YouTube, all those platforms that belong to the same people in the end, and they are part of the problem because they are perceived as part of the problem, and we can consider that they are, not perhaps voluntarily, but at least as disseminators and conveyor belts of that information. They are part of the problem, but they are also part of the solution. How do you think we can use those in our favor to stop or to attract them to us in order to fight that misinformation, either politically or whatever?
Well, I think platforms are aware that they have a problem and that it is better to self-regulate themselves than to be regulated by others. I think this is going to be the logic, and there will be a regulation at a European level that is going to be imposed so as to be more transparent and share more data. And also one thing that we haven't done, if you're able to escalate your business and earn incredible amounts of money because you're able to escalate your company, because this is the wonderful capacity that these new media have, then you must be able to escalate your responsibility, because platforms say to you, okay, we cannot control everything that is shared. Well, okay, if you can't control it, you cannot sell all the publicity that you're selling. I mean, one thing is wrong there. And then, therefore, I think in the future we will tend to regulate it, making them more transparent, making them more responsible of the contents that they share. And this is something that is being debated on continuously and making things more complicated. One of the wonders of Google was that you open an account in Google and you open a page and then you started uploading publicity, and maybe in the future this is not going to be so easy. Maybe in the future we will monetize posts, but not everybody will be able to do it. Maybe they have to register that intention or something, and maybe depending on the money investment they can do it in one way or another, or maybe they can record how many micro targets can be done. I don't know. And also we here we have a responsibility there. We must be aware that our data out there is a way to make others to send us publicity and messages that are built so as to manipulate our opinions, and they can do it very easily, because Facebook, no matter how many alerts you receive saying that we have changed our privacy policy, well, Facebook wants your data, and that's it. And we need to assume this, and we need to be more responsible of what we share in social media. Unless we do this, it's bad.
You said that the big platforms prefer to self-regulate compared to being regulated by the state. There's a sentence that I took a note of, which is what the technological giants of Silicon Valley share with fascism is their insistence on solving problems immediately without discussing them first. At this point in time, this mindset attracts more and more people. That is a sentence that really has a lot to it, has a lot of weight. Comparing them with fascism is no minor action. How do you relate that? How can you explain that? Give it a deeper explanation.
There is I mean, Facebook's slogan when they first set up was "Move fast and break things." So I think there is a sort of celebration of a type of violence in the sense that politics is most authentic when it moves at very high speed. Now, I'm not saying that that's the same as fascism or makes them fascist. What I mean is that a politics that celebrates speed in and of itself leans in that direction. I mean, we have the whole question, sorry to bring it back to Brexit again, but the whole question around this is now in Britain has come back to the more authentically Brexity you are, the more insistent you are that it can be done immediately without any type of difficulty, and it's completely simple. And the only people who don't agree with this are sort of Europeans and liberals and this sort of thing. So there is a sort of, I mean, it's, you know, in politics, there is a traditional political theory that goes back to the political theorist Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi, that the essence of politics lies in the moment of decision, that actually the democracy and parliaments are things that slow everything down through talking about things endlessly and removing the full force of political possibility. And in a way, I think that what I'm saying about the likes of Zuckerberg and Bezos and these sorts of people is that they are, they're anti-politics in the sort of sense that Pablo was talking about, of actually trying to reason why you believe something should be done, and they have inserted themselves into everyday lives of people at such speed that nobody had the chance to do anything. Look how Google created Google Books. they copied every single book in the world. They didn't ask permission to do it. It was in breach of copyright. And then later they had to sort of negotiate with people about, how they were going to manage the fact that they'd done this. So I think that equally Google can put businesses out of business, small business out of business, by tweaking its page rank. By, 1 minute you could be a taxi company that's on the front page, the next minute you're a taxi company on the 10th page, and suddenly your business doesn't work any longer. So these companies have put themselves into a position where the rest of us are dependent on them, and where they have complete sovereignty in the purest sense of sovereignty, that actually they can take these decisions which actually influence the rest of society. So they are far more like states in that particular sense, in that they have many of the attributes of states. They don't have armies and police forces, although armies and police forces are now dependent on them. I mean, the Pentagon is dependent on Amazon for its cloud computing. So I think that we need to see these companies as sources of a type of violence in the world. I mean, that might sound rather extreme, but we now need to think how we can tackle them. I don't think they have. I think if you were to do a sort of cost-benefit analysis of these companies, and overall they are negative in what they actually contribute to society.
Porque al final la dependencia que mencionaba...
Because that dependency that you mentioned is a fundamental factor, and we see it with those big corporations. It happens all the time that from governments to individuals we depend on those companies, and we are granting a certain power to them. Pablo, how do you see that more and more big companies are gaining more power than many states, and to what extent coercion goes from the state to corporations and not the other way around? It is much, it's becoming more symmetric, at least. Yeah, to link it to the prior reflection, the changes in communication infrastructures always entail big political changes. That is fundamental, because when the printing press emerged, Christianity just crumbled or collapsed, and also the radio and TV also created the same problem, and so the advent of the internet broke consensus, and new risks and opportunities emerged. I think that we noticed the passing of the crisis through us, because we thought that we had the utopia, that we believed that the internet was going to solve all our problems, and now we consider that the internet is the source of every problem. I heard a European politician say that the radio brought Hitler the same as the internet or Twitter brought Trump, and we have to be careful, slow down. Whenever we speak in one way or another, the material elements come into our debate again. We are talking about more vulnerable people that feel that they are lagging behind, that they have been left aside, where the state is not answering their demands. That is talking about very material questions beyond the communications infrastructure. And if you look, for example, if you take an electoral map nowadays, you will see a contrast between rural areas and the cities. In any map of any election campaign in the world, that means that territory is important, so the material elements have a weight beyond infrastructure. And this is the second part of the reflection, and it is important to make it. And it is data and information, such as we in these new circumstances, are a public asset. They are important, and we make decisions to regulate the media as public good. And we create public radios and TVs, because we consider it was important to control access to information so that it fulfilled one essential element, which is to provide elements for judgment to the citizens. And this is not being fulfilled because it's been outsourced to big corporations that can answer all the interests or requirements. The regulatory framework can be a way out, and I can be more provocative. Perhaps why are there not public social media? That would be more intrusive. Why is there no public Twitter or Facebook? Those are the two sides of the same coin. what type of practical solutions that are feasible can we implement? Because self-regulation has also its own limits, which are the interests of those corporations. And in the end, we have to speak about the overarching national framework or international framework, and which is the European Union. We are trying to gain sovereignty. When you have sovereignty on paper, but you cannot exert it, you don't have sovereignty. And we are gathering together to gain power on sovereignty and capacity to regulate those sorts of questions. Are those topics on the agenda? It seems that they are climbing positions. But if you look at the European Union, it seems to be business as usual. And we are talking about the small incremental changes of crisis that block us, and that's why, Clara, it would be excellent if you told us more about that. But there seems to be more work than it seems, and it appears at first sight. But this is a present challenge. It is not the future challenge. It is a present challenge, and we have to know what we can do, because this is a new framework.
I think the European Union, there is the playing ball, all the rules of the game on how to regulate reforms. The European Union, or at least the Commission, the first commitment they had was to regulate contents, and this is extremely dangerous because the line between censorship and being careful about the content, well, this is changing because they let the platforms to self-regulate with a principal code that was laughable, that they are not fulfilling because it was a principal code or code of principles that was contrary to most of the codes of principles, normally 10 different points, and they were choosing, these platforms were choosing which platforms, which points they were committing to. So this is absolutely crazy. I think the Parliament now is very much focusing on regulating platforms, and in addition to this, and this is, I think, is more important, the US has an eye on what Europe is doing. And here I think Europe is going to lead the wave and pave the way on how to regulate platforms, and then the US is going to follow what Europe does. Firstly, because their president now, the American president, is not the ideal person to do this. And secondly, because they create history.
Legislation becomes a very interesting topic, and we will have a question about that. But at this point in time, with breaking news, with Twitter working permanently, how can we analyze misinformation when the people who verify things, when the media arrive? It seems that the whole storm has gone by and everyone has an opinion, and then you have to go in there and tell the truth or explain something, and it seems that everything has been already decided. Or is it a hurdle for you?
Well, it is always an obstacle. I mean, one of the ideas contained in William's book is the idea that the sentiment is more difficult to be won with contrasted data. But I also have the idea that the democratization of information achieved by social media has made citizens aware of the fact that contrasted information is really more reliable. No matter where we are located in terms of feeling or sentiment, we feel betrayed when we are lied, and we are really, really fucked up, if I may say so, when we feel that we are being lied. And this is a scientific proof. I mean, we can see this with the Catalan issue here in Spain. People with a flag or with a yellow ribbon, they say, okay, well, I thought this had happened, but in the end it didn't happen. Well, to show the flag or the yellow ribbon on Twitter, you are really convinced about it. But they are indeed doing this, and they know that, and they are able to admit that they've been lied, and even in their environment, because of course my maldita.es is not going to be the reference newspaper of all the Spaniards that are convinced that these ideas are wrong, but at least these people that were using the flags, and then they go to their colleagues and they say, okay, this was a lie. I was wrong.
So, what do people do? People say, wow, I've been lied to, or they try to resist?
Well, I think it is an error to try to think that it is not possible to reconquer those people with facts and figures. I mean, it is true, it is difficult. Feelings dominate, feelings control. But it is possible. It is easier to tell a story with a lot of tears than with real facts. But I think that by using certain communicational strategies or making messages more sexy, I think that trying to reconquer the audience, I'm convinced of the fact that people are really feel betrayed when they are lied. And when this becomes aware or conscient, this is different.
Son las preguntas.
Before we open up the floor to the audience or to the people who are watching us through a streaming, I'm going to launch another question just to be to give some hope and not be too pessimistic. I'm going to read something. It is necessary to stop using language as a weapon and re-establish it as a tool to make promises so that democracy does not seem so belligerent in the future. Each from your point of view, how do you understand this? What hope is there? How can we improve that? What should we do to reverse or slow down the processes that we are witnessing and give some resources to the democracy that we have, because it may have the defects, but it isn't good.
I mean, I think that, inevitably this requires the participants in democracy to accept this. I mean, the problem is, of course, at the moment that people who want to turn democracy into a version of warfare, they can, and it's very difficult to know what to do with these people, and they have the opportunity, and they're often laughing. You know, that's the sort of status of these sort of troll-like political figures. I think that one of the things that, in some ways, there's a kind of opposition in my book between two different ideas of knowledge. One is the knowledge of war, of contestation, of disruption. And that of the Silicon Valley move fast and break thing mentality, which is I'm going to use knowledge in order to get an advantage over other people. The other is that knowledge is something that we can agree on, that it has something which is the basis of a common reality, that we might disagree about all sorts of things, but we nevertheless accept that these facts are the basis of a shared world in some way. Now, one of the difficulties I think we have is that who is going to be the basis of that sort of neutral third party in a way, once people don't see that either the judiciary or the independent media or any of these sorts of forces can provide that in a sense, the possibility of a neutral perspective is no longer seen to be credible by many people. I mean, this is how populism works, is that everything is a friend or an enemy. There's no independent place. I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book, is partly trying to get back to common human needs for, I talk about in some ways that health services have become kind of the last bastion of a common society. It's something that people still want the state to provide certain basic forms of social security when it matters to them and their families and their children, when it hits upon their most basic human needs for forms of security, for forms of healthcare and so on. And I think that, and I was mentioning earlier how I think it's interesting how one of the last professions that still has a kind of a public status that is beyond rebuke is the medical profession. Now, in terms of what does this mean for politics, I mean, I think that there are signs that the forces of what might be called partly, I suppose, a left populism, which is a possibility as represented by things like the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States, but that a type of mobilization that is around shared humanity, and I suppose this sounds extremely kind of optimistic, but can be a match for a type of mobilization which is in some ways sees democracy as a kind of branch of warfare or something like that. Because there is no longer an option to try and seek kind of common reality simply by reverting back to a set of institutions and a set of elites that have been deemed to have failed in various ways. So I think that in some ways, I mean, one of the reasons in the book I go back to talking about how did these institutions first get built in the 17th century is I think that there is a slow work of rebuilding them in some ways, maybe not from scratch, but by trying to think about how do these policies actually affect people in their sort of, you know, when it comes to their basic aspects of common life.
Pablo, no sé si quieres ir por esa línea, pasar a...
Pablo, I don't know whether you want to continue along those lines or go to political systems. Something that is related to the book, which is polarization. It is obvious that our societies are much more polarized than in the past, not just because of these huge structural changes that we have gone through, but also because of the economic crisis that has had a huge impact. And that has led to a situation where from the public conversation, in the public conversation we are starting to see two sides, where first we deny pluralism, the fact that the other one can think differently because either he is stupid or he is evil. So we deny the reason. You can make mistakes, but it is for strategic reasons, and they are evil if they make a mistake. And then what you have in front of you, on your side, everyone is heterogeneous, different points of view, but they are just a single block that has no legitimacy. That logic comes to show that institutions on their own are not enough for democracies to work. We need to build shared narratives, and that has to do with the agents. What are the moral flaws of the agents? What is what we consider acceptable and unacceptable from a political point of view? And here there are two key questions that we should look at. First is to rebuild shared meanings. Knowledge is extremely important, as the book states. But for example, in the conflict in Catalonia, for example, everyone is speaking about democracy, but they understand different things when they speak about democracy. So the problem is not in the word democracy. The problem is our interpretation or the meaning of shared meaning of democracy. If we do not have a shared meaning, we cannot know where we are heading towards. And secondly, and this is perhaps one of the components that has been destroyed by the social media, which is empathy, the capacity to put yourself in the shoes of the other. And that is essential. If we are not able to understand the other, it is impossible for us to come closer to the rational and look for some compromise, which is part of the reason for being of democracy. And the web destroys personality. It is cold. Statistics and data are not enough to persuade people. There has to be something that moves us, as something with which we can empathize. The evil ones, in inverted commas, they use it and they take advantage of emotions for their own benefit and for their own cause. And I go back to the initial sentence. It is not important to be right, but to be shown to be right. And that will never be enough, having data, if you are not able to touch people. That you can have a migrant as a neighbor with whom you can sit down and have a drink. Building empathy and building common meanings is the only thing that can help us overcome this reality. They say that Stalin said that the death of one person is a tragedy and the death of 1 million is a statistic. So regarding the creation of knowledge or verification of stopping fake news, how do you think we should do that? Where should we work on that? Let's solve all the problems of Spain.
Well, since Pablo has spoken about empathy, I think one thing that we need to focus more is the world of continuous immediacy. It's true that we have in our mobile phones, we have every minute after minute of the exhumation of Franco, the body of Franco, the dictator. And we need to learn whether it is good to follow one topic minute after minute, because in the end this influences in the conception of our world. It influences in how we focus on elections and how we vote. This morning I was here in another debate, and one of the things that we spoke about, and it is very significant, remember that the last elections were in April, and then it was always the difference between left and right what was the core of the speech. And now the axis of the elections now on the next 10th of November is Catalonia. And however, you have to think that from April up to now, the country has not changed so much, but the conception, our conception of reality is so linked to the timeline, I wouldn't say Twitter, but the timeline of constant current news that we are receiving, and we need to learn to stop and take a break and divide spaces and have a little moment just to reflect upon things, to think about things.
It is very interesting. It seems that ages have gone by. If we look at how things have changed, let's go on to open up the floor to the audience. Please, questions and not philosophical reflections and discourses. Please, just concise questions. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I can make my own. Hi, my question is for William and for Pablo. You have spoken about how political parties structure politics for decades as big groups that aggregated votes, but they have lost anchorage because they have become huge animals and they move very clumsily and they cannot adapt to immediacy and to the changing identities and so on. And then they suffer this personalistic nature of the leaders and perhaps they sacrifice the whole party just to win an election. I'm thinking about Trump or Boris Johnson. I don't know what is the situation the parties are left in and how they are going to survive to the situation afterwards. Perhaps identities are not so easy to categorize, so to speak, or to convince. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think that parties are in some cases being rejuvenated by embracing social movements, becoming seen as, I mean, in Britain for a while the Labour Party has been something which has had a kind of grassroots movement associated with it, which seems to have been quite effective in some ways. But then there's always the question about how does the kind of grassroots movement relate to the party hierarchy. I think the question is, I mean, new parties are obviously being created in an electoral system like France. It was relatively, well, not easy, but it was possible for Macron to produce a new party. But I think it's an absolutely crucial question, because I think that the party is the long-standing means by which a crucial form of kind of mediation between state and individual worked. And if you go back to the 1950s, across Europe, I mean, parties had this mass membership that was sort of hollowed out and gutted by the 1990s in most countries. I'm afraid I don't know I'm sure there are people who are thinking carefully about, what is the model for this, because people talk about, digital parties as being these kind of new types of virtual entities that can move at a much greater speed. And in Britain, there's, the right-wing populist Nigel Farage created a new party in January, and by April had come first in the European elections. But it's not really a party; it's actually a small business with an extremely active social media presence. So that's another type of thing, and that was very much modelled on the Five Star movement in Italy. So these are sort of some of the possibilities, but the extent to which that provides the type of shared meaning that Pablo's talking about is another matter, because in some ways they become quite kind of ephemeral, and they become things that sort of are born today and gone tomorrow, precisely because they speak to emotions more than stable interests, maybe partly because stable interests aren't things that people have to the same extent any longer. But maybe Pablo has some more constructive comments on that.
No, probably not. Solo tal vez.
Let's see, parties are useful for many reasons, because they recruit and socialize our leaders, because they mobilize us to go and vote, and because they provide informational shortcuts, so to speak, because they are close to the parties, and so we can know exactly what we should think about many topics. So they are a shortcut to structure politics. But the parties that emerged after the Second World War, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats and so on, they gave you an identity from the cradle to the grave. And you had a press, and some continue to have that liturgy. Those that were born at that point in time continue to have that liturgy, but that does not work any longer. From the 70s, the members of the parties have dropped. People are more enlightened, are more educated. You can participate in an NGO, in a social movement. You can influence politics in many other ways, in much more open ways. And the political parties have a bureaucracy, but they have become very professional. They are professionalized. Now you do not need to open a headquarters in every city of Spain. You just have to appear on the TV, and then you can get good results. So the context is completely new. What will we probably see? A recycling, where the old is not fully dead and the new is not fully born, where we will continue to have classical parties, people linked to those parties from baby boomers upwards, and then younger people who do not create that bond with the parties, or that might change new parties, and then a fragmentation and volatility scenario, which is much more prevalent. And so if you are close to a political platform, you will come much closer. And I'm sorry to say this, but it will be more like choosing a product in the supermarket among different political offers, more than something that makes you think, I am someone because I belong to this party. And the problem that might have is that beyond articulating identity, makes people impatient, because you want the product to produce results immediately. And so that parties can go up and down in surveys, appear and disappear, and we can have quite a curious syndrome, which is having a lot of we have nothing in the undercurrents, while we have lots of movements in the waves, because it is very difficult to change the underlying foundations of your society in 8 years. And ephemeral parties are very pictorial, but they cannot give you what they offer, because the paces of the politics is very different from the paces of the things that the politics work. And there is a decoupling between when you vote and when you receive those results. There is a gap there, and that is very difficult to bridge, that gap. How can we solve that? I don't know. I don't know if there are more questions on the here in the first row. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. You have been saying that the new technologies are opening up new markets that are more and are very accelerated. There is a bombardment with information, and then we get nervous if we cannot cope with that, and then we have an emotional response and not so much a rational response that requires some processing, and that's how we act publicly. To some extent, I think that acceleration or that speed prevents us from creating shared meanings, because everything changes at such high speed that we cannot create a narrative that survives for 3 months. And we have seen that. We have seen that in Spain with Podemos, with the collapse of the PSOE, and then the re-emergence. And my question is, what we see is that it is a new market that is bombarding that, and we don't hear anybody say we need to close markets in order to calm down. If we had to close a market, if we have to impose something on economy, what would be the markets that we should close?
Menos mal que yo modero.
Thank God that I'm the moderator only. That is a very complex question. Where we would cut down in the hypothetical case that we could do it and that we should do that.
It is the second moment that we are fixing the country here at the table.
So
I mean, well, look, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think the question of antitrust in relation to these tech giants is obviously still it's a more live one now than it was a while ago. And Elizabeth Warren, if she became president, I mean, this is part of, because that's the problem, is that you've got to have the right American president. That's the first thing for the platforms. I think in general, I mean, I'm not someone who sort of knows the sort of details of sort of, you know, the back end of how data gets bought and sold. I mean, there was clearly there was a fundamental problem with the business model of Facebook, as everyone has told Mark Zuckerberg over and over again. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was saying it yesterday, and he still pretends he doesn't understand. But the fundamental problem with this business model is that it frankly doesn't matter what content it shares, as long as people remain engaged in some way. And if you apply that same principle to kind of public debate and politics more generally, you're on the road to hell, because people can be engaged by all sorts of different things and emotions and forms of content and so on. I mean, I think that one thing that we have this debate going on in the UK at the moment about how to report on Boris Johnson, which there was the similar one in the United States about how to deal with Trump. And I think that journalists themselves are having to, well, they're not doing it yet, but they're talking about becoming less focused on first mover advantage in some sense. Now, this isn't necessarily closing down a market, but I think that the problem is that when knowing as quickly as possible and being the first to know, I mean, it's a bit like, you know, this point about having to track the exhumation over the course of today, minute by minute by minute. I'm not sure what regulators can do exactly to sort of inject pause or delay, but that's what we need. We need delay mechanisms. We need things which artificially insert delays into things. Like, and I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, we tackled pollution pollution was seen as inevitable in 1850, that the river was full of kind of, rubbish and shit, and like that was kind of how capitalism worked. And you regulate and you slow down and you make certain things illegal. So it's not impossible for things to get slower as well as faster. Exactly what the kind of pressure points are, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that the media themselves, I think that, public service broadcasters have a responsibility to hold themselves back to some extent. And I think that the journalist profession needs to, you can't focus on being first and also on being true the whole time. You have to, in some way, there is a trade-off between these two things, and that requires an element of self-regulation. As far as the actual markets that, I don't know, you say markets need to be closed down. I'm not even sure what an example of that would even be. I'm not sure if anyone knows, but... Sorry, no, but in relation to this, I mean, in relation to, no, I mean, I understand markets can be closed down. I mean, I think that, there are things that should be banned, like facial recognition technologies and these sorts of things. I mean, there are lots of these sorts of things that don't have to be treated as inevitable. I agree.
I just wanted to mention two things with this. I think, and I heard that in many conversations in the latest days, there are many highly utopical models. I call it the unicorn journalism. but is the name I gave it. The idea of coming out of Facebook and Google, I think this is not realistic. I mean, platforms exist and they are here to stay. And the idea of closing down a market, I think, is not realistic. I don't think it's going to happen. And maybe we will see, maybe the maximum will be what happened to Google News. It simply disappeared. I mean, it's just a way for editors or publishers to earn more. What you were saying about the idea that the self-regulation idea, I think the problem lies beyond that. The big problem of mass media, not only in Spain but on a global level, is that they don't have a business level. Their business level is exactly against the truth or veracity of information. If you are always following or chasing the last piece of news, then of course you cannot deepen on an analysis. And where before journalists were making 25 pages on paper, and it's impossible to contrast the reality or the veracity of all those news. If everything lies on having a lot of public vista, a lot of clicks, a lot of I likes, you never contrast things. And by way of example, because I think this is a significant example, what happened in the 2017 Catalan elections, somebody, I am not going to say who, media, published that Junquera was sent to a punishment kind of prison, or the solitary confinement cell. And 2 minutes after, this appeared in all national media in this country, and it was a lie. And verifying this entailed to calling the communication chief in the ministry, in the Home Office. And this is a telephone number that all journalists have, and nobody called him. And all the media published that. I mean, it's a model problem. It's not a market model problem. Sorry.
I fully agree. I think there was a question here. No? Any more questions?
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you. My question is for William. I would like to know what is more dangerous, that emotions are getting hold of society, or that there is a bias or confirmation or verification bias in news?
What is more dangerous? That there is emotions. I don't think that. I mean, these are similar issues, right? I mean, this is the idea that in some ways we kind of are led by our existing sort of often unconscious and cultural expectations about the world, and that that news often reinforces certain types of biases and so on. I'm not quite sure what the question is getting towards. I mean, I mean, these are similar phenomena. I mean, news. We have all. I mean, and this predates the internet. I mean, the biases of newspapers and so on have been kind of playing with people's emotions for decades. This is and the idea of propaganda dates back to the 1930s. So, I mean, that's not in itself a new thing. I think these are sort of similar. These are related things. I'm not quite sure how I'm meant to say which one is the most dangerous when these things are sort of these are different ways in which an ideal of objectivity is challenged right now. But I'm sorry if I don't want to kind of specify one or the other necessarily.
Bueno, si es
one more, if it's short, please make it short.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. 2 questions I'd like to ask. They are both brief. One is the relation with the traceback between the social and the psychological effects of inequality and all these effects on nervous states. And one idea that is not exploited sufficiently, which is the phenomenon of permanence of the ones that lose are always the same ones. And this is reminding me of the Hirschman tunnel effect. If the rules change and the losers are not always the same over time, maybe we were not facing this situation. And the second question goes on significant meanings. How do you build common meanings when the structural conditions are different, without visibilizing the structural differences? You were talking about Technocracy and saying that academics and experts are normally seen as a higher hierarchy, but now the working conditions are very precarious. And so how can you build something when you have such differences?
The questions were short, but they could be answered with a PhD paper.
I mean, I think there is one of the things I explore in the book is how inequality over time has become inscribed on people's physical health as much as anything else, and the way in which people's I mean, I think Pablo was talking earlier about the need to focus on some of the material aspects of inequality today, such as the regional and so on. But I think there's also, there are these sort of very disturbing physiological ways in which inequality is inscribed on people today. I mean, you see this in, you know, the distribution of the Le Pen vote in France is in areas with significantly lower life expectancy than the average, and this sort of thing. And there's also, I mean, obviously different age groups that vote in different ways and so on. Now, I think that this is partly, I mean, I'm sort of just going to kind of agree with what you're saying, which is that this is the inscription of the experience of repeated loss over many years. But I think that one thing which, and this is partly relates back to my previous book of mine, The Limits of Neoliberalism, is that I think what is particularly stressful about the ideological regime that many Western capitalist societies have adopted over the last 40 years is that it tries to it takes the social and makes it psychological in the way that you're kind of alluding to, because it says that people are responsible for their own outcomes. That it's an ideology which says that inequality is not the result of class or structure, but the result of competition and of meritocracy. And therefore, that those who rise to the top have done so through their efforts, and those at the bottom are probably lazy and this sort of thing. Now, this produces its own particular psychological effects, which are, firstly, it's extremely stressful because it means that you have to live with anxiety about your own sort of performance, your own precarity, your own status, day in, day out, that you're not able, it becomes more shameful to kind of rely on the collective or on the state and this sort of thing. And this is how welfare states have been attacked for the last 30 years. But I think that also, of course, it's also a sort of delusional view that people are that responsible and that autonomous when it comes to their own life situation and their own economic situation. So I think in that sense, there is a sort of, I think that accounts for the fact that people are living lives that are going off in different directions in terms of their health, their mental health, and in different areas of the labour market. The labour market is viewed radically differently. I think you're right that this drift towards precarity and towards insecurity has clearly shifted, particularly since 2008, further and further into the supposedly privileged graduate areas of the labour market. And in that sense, I think that means that there are more and more people who don't feel that they actually are actually having their interests preserved or looked after by this system. I don't think it stops a populist leader from still painting these people as being some kind of cultural elite, because after all, the cultural privileges that these people are alleged to hold don't come down to money. They come down to being able to speak in a certain kind of way and, being able to tick other people off for speaking in a wrong way, or so it is alleged. But I think you're making an important point about, the that the structural forces behind that are obviously much more complicated than some of the sort of surface level kind of cultural divisions as they often get discussed.
Bueno, pues si no...
Well, if there are more questions, you can ask the author because he's going to sign copies of his book. But we have to call it a day today. We would like to thank you very much, Fundación Telefónica, for welcoming us, the publishing house, also the translators for the work that they do. It's quite an important one. And of course, William, Pablo, and Clara for being here with us. And all the audience, the attendees that have come to our call to discuss this interesting topic. He will be signing copies of his book, so you can ask him quickly whatever you consider appropriate, and he can fix the world for you. Thank you very much, and see you next time.